They say you can't own Naturia, but she sure gave it her best shot. 60 cabins, a floating eatery, and a flashy new name for the lake my grandfather dedicated his life to protecting. Clarice Vaughn seemed to think that money, paperwork, and a rehearsed smile could rewrite history. She had no idea who she was challenging or what this place would do once it's had enough. Ever seen someone push too far, thinking no one could stop them? I genuinely love to hear your story in the comments. My name's Roy Callan, and I thought I had Lake Haven all figured out. For 15 years, I managed dam operations for this exact water system before I retired early. This lake wasn't just a job, it was part of my legacy, passed down from my grandfather, who built his log cabin on its shores back in the 50s. I thought retirement meant calm days and quiet fishing. I clearly miscalculated. Peace doesn't last long when greed gets involved. That Tuesday started like any other. I grabbed my tackle box and headed out for some morning bass fishing. Mist still hung over the surface like a pale, sleeping fog, but as I steered my boat around the old pine grove, something ahead made my stomach drop. Construction signs, big, flashy, corporate signs everywhere. Anna Dramanes Luxury Retreats, 60 upscale rental cabins, opening summer 2024, not 10, not 20, 60. Who built 60 anything around a quiet family lake? But it didn't stop at cabins. The signs promised a marina, a floating restaurant, and something they called a waterfront event center. I stared at the sign until the words blurred together. An event center on the same waters where my grandfather once taught me how to read clouds and currents was now being repackaged as a tourist playground. Was I overreacting? Maybe, but it felt like someone planning to build a shopping mall in my living room. I tied up my boat and stormed over to the HOA, which, in our town, was just a renovated garage behind the rec center. Clarice Vaughn sat there in her high heels and higher confidence, barely looking up from her laptop, typing like she was orchestrating something epic. I stood there, boots still muddy, face probably burning with frustration, waiting for her to acknowledge me. When she finally glanced up, she gave me that fake, polished smiley, the kind that says she's already 2 moves ahead of you. Mr. Callan, right? What can I help you with this morning? You can tell me why the hell there are 60 vacation cabins popping up around my family's lake, I snapped. And no, I didn't say it calmly. Who would? Her smile only widened, somehow making her more terrifying. She pulled open a drawer, slid out a fat folder, and laid down some official-looking paperwork like she'd done it 100 times. This lake, she said smoothly, is going to be the jewel of our vacation rental portfolio. Our lake, her crown jewel? I had to blink twice. Did she just say that? And that's when things really twisted. In that sugar-coated tone, she explained that she had been secretly purchasing every bit of lakefront property over the last 6 months through a web of companies, shell corporations, and legal tricks. While I'd been enjoying what I thought was peaceful retirement in a like-minded community, she had been scheming to turn Lake Haven into a full-on luxury resort. She used names like Serenity Holdings LLC and Tranquil Waters Developmental, designed to look like separate investors. In truth, it had always been her, orchestrating a single vision behind a curtain of aliases. It's all perfectly above board, she said, sliding a business card toward me with infuriating confidence. Every zoning code followed, every environmental check approved, the planning board signed off, unanimously. I looked down at the card. Vaughn Development Group. That name chilled me. This wasn't a half-baked project. This was an empire in motion, and I was the last to see it coming. She'd been playing chess while I was still figuring out how to move the pieces. Walking back to my cabin, everything felt different. Or maybe I was finally seeing what was being lost. The morning mist had lifted. The lake was like glass, still and perfect, the way it always was. Loons called in the distance. A blue heron stood frozen at the edge of the shallows. Soon, all of it would be gone, replaced by roaring jet skis, clinking glasses from a floating bar, and who knows what else. The thought turned my stomach. Maybe I should have walked away, let Clarice win, start over somewhere else. But then I heard my grandfather's voice in my memory, as clear as if he were sitting beside me on the dock. Some things are worth fighting for, even when you know you might lose. That's when I detoured toward the old dam control station, hidden behind a grove of pines, barely noticeable to anyone passing by. I still had the keys from when I worked there. No one ever asked for them back. Inside, everything was just how I'd left it. Dusty maps, engineering notes, hand-drawn schematics that only made sense to someone who lived and breathed that lake's water systems. I rolled them out across the metal desk and started tracing the lines of pipes, valves, pressure gates, an entire language of flow and control, a language I knew better than anyone. These weren't just blueprints. They were 15 years of quiet, expert understanding. I knew this lake like the back of my hand, how its waters flowed silently through hidden channels beneath the earth, how pressure would rise and shift during storms, how nature had shaped this entire system long before humans brought blueprints and bulldozers. Clarice Vaughn might have believed she now owned Lake Haven, but she had no clue what she was really dealing with. As I studied those detailed schematics, something inside me hardened in outrage. Exactly, but a colder, sharper resolve. I remember thinking, lady, you picked the wrong lake, you broken bar, and definitely the wrong man to cross. 3 days later, the harassment began. Like Clarice had circled it on her calendar and was just waiting for the right moment to pounce. That morning, I found an official HOA violation notice taped to my front door. It was printed on paper fancier than most people's wedding invites. The supposed offense? Improper waterfront upkeep. Apparently, my fishing dock and tackle box no longer met their so-called aesthetic guidelines. They slapped me with a $500 fine and demanded a written plan explaining how I'd beautify my property. I read it twice, wondering if this was some kind of sick joke. That dock was built by my grandfather in 1962. It had survived everything from hailstorms to floods for over 60 years, and now it was considered an eyesore. This was psychological warfare, and no doubt about it. Clarice wanted to make life so unpleasant for me that I'd eventually pack up and disappear, leaving her to redesign the lake in peace without resistance from stubborn old-timers. And truthfully, it started working. In just a few days, I noticed a shift in how people treated me. Neighbors I'd waved to every day for years now crossed the street or suddenly found something interesting to look at on the ground. Mrs. Henderson, who used to stop at my driveway for a 5-minute chat about weather patterns and owl speed, walked past like she was late for a marathon. At the time, it didn't make any sense. But the truth came out soon enough. Clarice had been working behind the scenes, feeding lies about me to the community, twisting my career history into some kind of scandal. According to her version of the story, I had been fired from my dam management position for repeated safety violations. It was complete fiction, utter nonsense, but it worked. She was spreading the narrative that I was reckless, unstably broken bar, someone who shouldn't be trusted with so much as a garden hose, let alone the control systems of a dam. 15 years I ran the system. 15 years of controlling water levels, preventing seasonal floods, maintaining old and obscure machinery that no one else even understood. I'd received multiple safety awards and had been formally recognized for my commitment to community protection. Now I was being framed as a washed-up hazard. Earl Simmons was the one who finally told me what was being said. Earl was a no-nonsense guy in his 70s, lived around the lake longer than most of the trees, and wasn't dazzled by Clarice's tailored suits or corporate charm. He shook his head, his voice low and gravelly. "Roy," he said, "that woman's got people believing you're some kind of half-crazed old man who couldn't manage a faucet, much less a dam." That's when I decided I had to push back through legal channels. It seemed like the smart, civilized way to go. Maybe I was still a little too hopeful back then, a broken bar still clinging to the idea that truth and evidence carried weight, even in a system that favored money and influence. Enter Logan Pierce, fresh out of law school, probably no older than 26. Logan had just opened his practice in town. He looked like the kind of guy who still got ID'd when buying cough syrup, but when he listened to my story, he didn't laugh or shrug. He got angry, genuinely angry. Logan still believed the system worked for regular folks and not just the wealthy. He slammed his hand on the desk, scattering paperwork. "This," he said, "is exactly the kind of corporate steamrolling that gives development a bad name, with the kind of fire you only find in people who still believe in justice." Logan got to work. Earl started rallying the older families, and I brought the one thing that might actually make a difference: proof. proof that the lake couldn't support Clarice's monstrous plan. We filed a formal complaint with the town planning board. We gathered signatures from longtime residents who knew what this lake used to be. Even Davia, 2 cabins down, the guy I once helped fix his gutter, signed our petition. That one hurt. The public hearing was scheduled for a Thursday night at the high school auditorium. We walked in feeling like David facing down Goliath, but at least we had our slingshot. And the stones were real. Environmental impact studies, traffic reports, slogan dug up, eyewitness testimony from people who had lived on this lake long before outsiders showed up waving contracts. We thought we had a shot. Looking back, a broken bar, we walked into a trap. Clarice strolled in draped in luxury and certainty. She brought a presentation that probably cost more than my entire year's retirement budget. Professional slide decks, market analysis, beautiful 3D renderings of what she claimed would be a lakeside paradise. It was a masterclass in manipulation. She painted a picture of economic growth, job creation, increased tax revenue, everything a small town board loves to hear, and Anna Dramenest was stamped boldly on every glossy page, like a promise of perfection. Clarice proudly declared she was bringing Lake Haven into the 21st century. And her team of attorneys nodded along like she was rewriting the Constitution. Meanwhile, the planning board practically leaned forward in their seats, eyes lighting up with every mention of projected tax revenue and construction milestones. You could practically see the dollar signs bouncing around in their heads. When Logan took the floor to present our opposition, the mood in the room shifted sharply. Suddenly, we weren't concerned residents speaking up for our HOA, we were relics, obstacles, grumpy holdouts standing in the way of what they called progress. The vote, unanimous, 5-0. Not one member asked a single question, raised a concern, or even hesitated. No one considered that just maybe, stuffing 60 rental cabins and a floating restaurant into a quiet family lake was overkill. Clarice didn't so much as glance my way as she packed up her materials. Her high heels clicked across the auditorium floor like the ticking of a countdown to one that signaled the end of the lake I'd always known. I sat there, watching the board members shake hands and slap each other's backs, and I felt something go ice cold inside me. So much for justice. So much for the environmental data, community concerns, and the rights of people who lived there their entire lives. When money speaks, everything else just fades into background noise. That night, I copied the lake's water pressure logs onto a flash drive. Maybe the legal route had hit a dead end, but nature still listened to me. I didn't even need the maps anymore. I knew every twist and valve of this lake's arteries by heart. The next morning, I set out to visit a place most folks didn't even know existed, a forgotten water regulation system tucked deep in the woods. It wasn't the big, visible dam everyone drove past. No. This was a hidden network of manual valves and buried channels designed decades ago to help regulate spring floods and maintain balance in the system. It had been built back in the 70s, back when engineers still respected the idea of working with nature instead of fighting it. I never did understand why the county left it off the records when they built Idaho, but their oversight was about to become Anna Dramenest's very expensive problem. Earl insisted on coming along, partly out of curiosity, partly out of concern that I might be slipping off the edge. "Roy," he said as we pushed through thick brush, stepping over fallen limbs and ducking under low-hanging branches, "tell me you're not about to flood half the lake over a grudge. This isn't like you." I had to laugh. Earl was 73, with the kind of grounded wisdom that comes from watching a lifetime of small-town politics and big-time mistakes. He'd seen enough to know when someone was getting played. And he wasn't the kind to just stand by. "I'm not destroying anything," I told him, holding back a branch so he could pass through. "I'm just putting the water back where it wants to go, or where it used to go before they jammed everything up with cement and bulldozers." And I wasn't lying. Anna Dramenest's crew had unknowingly disturbed several underground springs when they bulldozed the land for construction. Their machines blocked natural drainage paths with fill dirt and debris, disrupting a system that had been balancing itself for centuries. When water started doing unpredictable things, their engineers scratched their heads, confused. I wasn't confused. We arrived at the hidden control station. It was right where I left it, shielded by pine trees and overrun by wild raspberry bushes. nearly invisible unless you knew what to look for. The metal housing was rusty but held together. My old combination lock still clicked open, even after 3 years away. Inside were the same manual valves I used to manage the subsurface springs that fed into Lake Haven. Earl watched as I checked readings and made notes in the waterproof notebook I'd kept for 15 years. The numbers told a story few others could read about pressure building behind block channels, about water being forced through unnatural paths that weakened the soil foundation. "You sure you still remember how all this works?" Earl asked, but he already knew the answer. My hands moved over those controls like I'd never left, adjusting flow rates, resetting pressure, all according to seasonal patterns etched into my memory. This system was built for spring floods. I wasn't damaging anything, I was just letting it do its job again. I made a few careful adjustments, nothing drastic or irreversible, just enough to restore the natural flow, releasing the pressure the construction had carelessly bottled up. Earl kept asking if I was certain about what I was doing. The truth, I wasn't entirely sure anymore, but I knew this lake, I knew water, and I knew that some things are worth standing up for, even if you can't fully predict what comes next. And then a broken bar had happened. The very next morning, Anadromnest's construction crew arrived at the build site, and what they found waiting for them was nothing short of spectacular. The holes they had dug began to slowly fill with groundwater, like the earth itself was quietly rejecting their grand vision. The sun was shining, not a cloud in sight, no rain for miles, but still, the water kept rising, bubbling up from underneath, like the land was weeping in protest. I was out on my fishing boat, keeping a good distance, far enough not to raise suspicion, but close enough to witness the unraveling. From where I sat, they looked like children trying to rescue a collapsing sandbox with plastic shovels. The construction foreman paced with a radio in hand, probably reporting to Clarice, trying to explain something none of their expensive consultants could solve. "Ma'am," I heard him say, "we've got water pushing through the foundation pits. The pumps can't keep up. It's like the whole site's spring-loaded. We'll need heavy-duty equipment to deal with this." Ever watched someone ignore every warning sign and still act shocked when it all goes sideways? If you've got a story like that, drop it in the comments. About an hour later, Clarice arrived, stepping out of her polished white Mercedes like she was stepping onto a red carpet, convinced that money and power could fix what knowledge and respect for the land had failed to. She tiptoed across the muddy construction site in designer heels that probably cost more than I spend on groceries in 2 months, barking questions about drainage and soil reports. It was like watching someone try to lecture a river into flowing upstream. Her voice carried across the water, rising with each unanswered question, frustration creeping in as her engineers struggled to explain that the water wasn't coming from rain or pipe as it was emerging from underground sources they couldn't trace or control. Watching her carefully constructed poise crack, little by little, was more satisfying than I'd expected. It wasn't revenge-y, not exactly. It was more like the land was setting the record straight. Clarice didn't understand the first thing about how natural systems work, and she clearly hadn't thought for a second that Lake Haven might not bow to her ambition. She kept jabbing her finger at blueprints, like pointing harder would make the groundwater go away. She muttered about miscalculations and design flaws like the problem could be fixed with better architecture or fancier drainage diagrams. But you can't engineer your way around underground springs that have been flowing since the last ice age. You don't just dump 60 vacation homes on a wetland and expect the soil to roll over and behave. I stayed on the water for hours, watching her crew throw machinery and manpower at the problem, trying to pump out what nature kept stubbornly putting back in. It was like watching a slow-motion uprising, and for the first time in years, I felt grounded, like I was exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. By afternoon, I could hear Clarice's voice bouncing across the lake, sharp and panicked as she stormed around the flooded pits. "I don't care what it costs. Bring in industrial pumps. Fix it. We've got investors flying in next week." That's when it hit me. She wasn't backing off. She was digging in, refusing to listen, to adapt, to even consider that maybe the lake was trying to send her a message. Either she was more stubborn than I thought, or she had more money to burn than I'd imagined. Either way, watching her march through that mud, waving her arms like a traffic cop on a runaway freeway, was enough to tell me this was only the beginning. The foundation issues that would have made any reasonable person reconsider weren't even slowing her down. She was treating this like a war she could win with brute force. She called in more equipment, larger pumps, deeper trenches, even higher-priced consultants who charged by the hour to confirm what I could have told her for free. You don't build luxury cabins on top of a living, breathing watershed and expect everything to go according to plan. But Clarice Vaughn wasn't the kind to admit defeat or even mild inconvenience. She didn't believe in limits, especially not those set by geology, hydrology, or common sense. Right before the big grand opening, I made one last quiet move. I sent Anadromnest's investors an anonymous weather report, highlighting unstable groundwater patterns and flood risk zones. It wasn't illegal, just a helpful nudge in the right direction. I circled some danger areas in red and left them to draw their own conclusions. But Clarice didn't blink. Instead of postponing or re-evaluating, she doubled down, announcing a lavish opening ceremony on her new floating event platform. Local officials, potential investors, and media personalities were all invited to bask in the glory of her gleaming, high-end lakefront dream. I'll admit it was almost impressive how confident she remained, like she truly believed she could stop a freight train with nothing but charm and a polished PowerPoint. Problem was, the forecast was grim. Severe thunderstorms were rolling in that weekend, the kind that had flooded this region long before anyone even considered laying down asphalt or selling lakeside memberships. I watched my old radar system like I used to in the control room, eyes fixed, hard steady, knowing exactly what was coming. And Clarice, she was too busy polishing champagne glasses to notice the storm. Managing dam operations taught me to read storms like some folks read novels. Air pressure drops, storm cell movement, wind shear patterns. It was a language I knew by heart, and this incoming system wasn't just any storm, it was going to be a monster. Torrential rain, gale force winds, the kind of weather that transforms gentle streams into violent floods and makes quiet lakes behave like ocean surf. Clarice either didn't know how to interpret a radar map, or she simply didn't care about minor inconveniences like natural disasters. She sent out glossy invitations promising sunny skies and serene waters for an afternoon of elegant lakeside entertainment. In hindsight, maybe I should have warned her about the approaching storm, but honestly, would she have listened to the same crazy old man she'd spent weeks slandering around town? While she was planning champagne toasts, several longtime residents organized something of their own, a peaceful protest by boat. It wasn't my idea, but I joined in anyway, cruising slowly in my battered aluminum skiff while her guests tried to enjoy cocktails on a floating platform that was already beginning to tilt under uneven weight. Earl showed up in his clunky old boat, its motor sputtering like a lawnmower with bronchitis. Dressed in stained overalls and a trucker cap, he puttered lazy loops around the sleek event barge like a man on a mission. Honestly, it was more entertaining than anything you'd find in a movie theater. It was the perfect contrast, locals who knew the lake and cared about it deeply, circling a high-budget vanity project full of people who saw Lake Haven as just another asset in their portfolio. The Richardsons joining aboard their faded pontoon, the Kowalskis paddled up in their canoe, and several other families who had summered and later lived here for decades made quiet rounds. We didn't shout or disrupt, we just circled, like a silent reminder that this place had a history before profit margins and branding strategies showed up. The news crews ate it up. They framed it as an Anadromnest-style standoff between grassroots preservation and luxury development. Human interest gold. But what they didn't catch was the sky. Behind Clarice's glitzy speeches and flawless presentation, storm clouds were gathering like an army on the mark, low, dark, and heavy with intent. Clarice stood on her swaying platform, delivering a grand speech about unlocking economic potential and reimagining underutilized natural assets. Her champagne flute sparkled in the weak sunlight as she declared a new era for Lake Haven. For a brief moment, I almost thought she might pull it off. As the clapping swelled and the guests smiled at their imagined profits, I slipped away to the dam's main control station. The platform was packed with investors, local politicians, influencers, and socialites. They held wine glasses like trophies while Clarice described how our peaceful lake would soon be a top-tier luxury destination. Ever watched someone build their own downfall and decorate it with fairy lights? If so, share your anadrama nest in the comments. This one even had appetizers and a jazz trio. I still had my keys and all my knowledge. This wasn't revengeia, it was standard safety procedure. For 15 years, I'd operated this system during extreme weather events, following protocols designed to protect the entire community. I wasn't doing anything reckless, I was doing what I'd always done. The only difference now was that no one had asked me to. Just as the storm hit its peak, I opened the gates in line with the pressure readings and the storm intensity. Wind whipped across the water, waves crashed like fists, and rain came down in sheets, hammering the lake's surface like war drums. But I followed the procedure perfectly. The result: devastating, spectacular, and inevitable. Water surged through the system, mixing with weeks of trapped runoff and blocked drainage paths caused by Clarice's construction. The rising lake levels didn't just creep, they surged. Clarice's floating venue began to list hard to the right. Buffet tables slid across the deck like lifeboats escaping a sinking ship. Fancy hors d'oeuvres floated like lily pads. Guests in tailored suits and designer dresses slipped in the mud, clutching flutes of sparkling wine and screaming as the sound system blew out in a shower of sparks. The mayor's wife landed flat in a puddle, her sequin gown soaked, her hair hanging in damp ropes. The county commissioner tried to wade ashore, his shoes swallowed by the muck. Tablecloths waved like surrender flags. Someone lost a shoe to the current. And through it all, the lake didn't roar, it whispered. I was here first. Clarice shouted orders like a field general watching her army scatter. Her mascara ran down one cheek, her high heels sunk in the same mud she once dismissed as redevelopable shoreline. Her sleek hair, once perfectly styled, was now a wet helmet. Her tailored blazer was soaked and streaked with muck. In 10 minutes flat, the woman who had once strutted across that stage like she owned the world now looked like she had wandered out of a disaster movie. And honestly, she kind of had. The look in her eyes as her guests scattered like mice from a burning barn. Oh well, it was worth every court summons that was surely coming. I stayed hidden behind the tree line, watching Clarice's luxury brand launch unravel into a soggy disaster. And I felt something I hadn't felt since my grandfather first taught me how to cast a line. The deep, quiet satisfaction of witnessing natural justice unfold. Welcome to the real Lake Haven, Clarice. This is what happens when you bulldoze history and disrespect nature. The next morning, I stepped out to find 2 motion-activated cameras aimed straight at my front porch, black, beady eyes mounted like silent threats, and a letter taped to my door with the kind of government seal that makes your heart drop. The notice read, subject of criminal investigation, a willful property damage. I'd expected this the moment I opened the floodgates, but that didn't stop my stomach from tightening when I read it. Clarice Vaughn wasn't the type to lick her wounds in silence, especially not after being humiliated in front of investors, media, and half the town. It got worse. Turns out the new kid working the bait shop, the one I'd hired just last summer, had been snapping photos of my cabin and passing them to Clarice. Claimed he thought it was zoning stuff. I told him to keep the tip money and never dial my number again. 3 days later, her lawsuit arrived, hand-delivered by a process server who looked like he'd rather be anywhere but standing on my muddy front steps. Clarice was suing me for millions. Property damage, sabotage, reckless endangerment. The legal papers were stacked an inch thick and written in language that somehow managed to feel both impersonal and personally devastating. Willful destruction of private infrastructure, intentional interference with commercial development, endangering the public. Reading it was like being body slammed over and over by someone wearing a $5,000 suit and a smug smile. Page after page accused me of everything short of eco-terrorism. They had security footage, too heavily edited, trimmed, and stitched together with the precision of a political smear ad. Gone were the storm warnings, the radar data, the pressure logs, the standard emergency procedures I'd followed faithfully for over 15 years. What remained was footage of me at the dam, turning valves in the rain, and no context, no explanation, just enough to make me look like a lunatic bent on chaos. Logan Pierce, my young lawyer with the stubborn heart of a reformer, spent hours going through it with me. He paused, rewound, took notes, squinted at every frame that made me look particularly dangerous. "This is a setup," he muttered finally. "They edited this like a trailer for a villain origin story." But Logan wasn't just some fresh grad in a second-hand blazer. He'd been digging, and what he found changed everything. "Roy," he said, laying out papers like evidence from a crime scene, "if we can prove her engineers ignored these flood zone reports, we've got something stronger than a defense. We've got grounds for negligence, buried deep in the county archives, where most people wouldn't bother to look." Logan uncovered the smoking gun, old geological surveys, my original engineering logs, and the very flood zone documentation I had filed during my 15 years managing Lake Haven. They showed it plain as daylight that the land Clarice built on was unsuitable for large-scale development. The water tables were unstable, the soil couldn't handle dense construction, and the underground springs were real, documented, and dangerous when blocked. Those reports had been sitting untouched in the county's dusty basement archives, and somehow conveniently they had been ignored during the planning approval process. "This wasn't just a mistake," Logan said. "This was either willful ignorance or criminal incompetence, maybe both." We were heading to court. The preliminary hearing was set for a Tuesday morning in district court. I wore the same navy suit I'd bought for my retirement party 3 years earlier. Clarice arrived dressed like she was bankrolling a private law firm, which, to be fair, she probably was. Her lawyers flanked her like bodyguards, polished and hungry. The courtroom felt like a battlefield. Her legal team sat like generals planning a siege, all briefcases and cold eyes. Across from them sat just me and Logan, two underdogs clinging to technical manuals, public records, and the one thing Clarice never bothered to understand, the truth. When the judge asked me to explain my actions, I stood, cleared my throat, and spoke the way I always had, with quiet, clear honesty. I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't angry. I just told the story as it happened. I explained how water moves, how underground pressure builds, how ignoring seasonal flow patterns leads to failure. I spoke like I was back at the control room, teaching a new apprentice how to respect the system. And in that moment, I wasn't the villain in Clarice's edited tape. I was the only person in the room who actually understood what happened. "Your Honor," I said, standing straighter than I had in months, "I didn't open a single valve that wasn't designed to be opened during severe storm conditions. I followed the same emergency flood control protocols I'd used for 15 years safely, effectively to protect this community." I paused, then added, "When I turned those gates, I did what my grandfather would have done. Protected the land, not the plans." He didn't just leave me a lake, he left me a promise. The judge, a quiet, older man with deep-set eyes and the tired posture of someone who'd presided over too many land disputes and political power plays, listened with the kind of patience that only comes from decades of sorting through competing realities. He watched both sides closely, like someone who knew how power liked to dress itself up as truth. Logan laid out our case with calm precision. The anadromous reports Clarice's team had ignored, the environmental flags the town had conveniently dismissed, the procedural guidelines I'd followed down to the decimal. It wasn't a flashy presentation, just facts, stubborn, documented, undeniable facts. Clarice's lawyers, on the other hand, tried to reduce me to some bitter ex-employee, a relic of the past, clinging to outdated methods and resentful of progress. But their narrative unraveled under the weight of 15 years of safety commendations, county awards, and spotless operations records. They couldn't explain those away, no matter how many polished words they stacked against them. The judge dismissed the criminal damage claim for lack of evidence. He even noted on the record that floodgate activation during a storm was not only legal, but required. That was a win, but not the end. The judge ordered further review into overall dam management practices, leaving the door cracked for future action. Clarice didn't say a word to me as we left the courthouse, but the look she gave me, broken bar, had said more than any lawsuit ever could. Like she'd rather burn the entire lake to the ground than lose to someone she believed was beneath her. Her lawyers were already huddled together on the courthouse steps, plotting next moves like generals regrouping after a failed siege. Logan walked me back to my truck, his face tight. I could tell by the way he hesitated that something was coming. "Roy," he finally said, voice low, "they've started digging into your employment history, a broken bar, and your mental health records." I stared at my reflection in the side mirror, jaw clenched. "They're trying to paint you as unstable," Logan continued. "Not just wrong but dangerous. Like you acted out of delusion, not judgment." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how far she'd go to erase me from the picture entirely. How easy it is to destroy some union not with evidence, but with doubt. All she had to do was make people wonder. The real storm started a week later, not in the skies, but in the media. What I'd thought was a local zoning dispute became the centerpiece of a full-blown smear campaign. The face of it, Brad Henley, a former co-worker from my Anadromines days, a man I trusted, shared emergency shifts with, fixed busted turbines beside, laughed with during blackouts and fished with on slow Sundays. There he was, sitting in a polished news studio under soft lighting, telling the whole county that I'd been reckless for years, that I'd had temper problems, ignored protocols, lashed out during maintenance planning. Lies, manufactured from half-truths, inflated with just enough familiarity to feel plausible. Brad was taking a paycheck from Clarice to sell the story. The headline that followed, "Former dam manager accused of sabotaging, mental health questions raised." And beneath that, a still frame of me leaving the courthouse, drenched from the earlier storm, looking like a maniac caught mid-rant, the kind of image that shapes opinions faster than facts ever could. The footage showed flooded construction sites, investors yelling on phones, workers dragging drenched equipment out of the mud. Paired with my photo, it made me look like the villain in a disaster movie, like some lunatic with a grudge. The news anchor said I was unhinged, a potential threat, that I'd spent years plotting to destroy the very progress our community needed. It wasn't reporting, it was character assassination. I watched it from my recliner, coffee in hand. Same mug my grandfather gave me the day I got the job. And for the first time since all this began, I felt something crack in my chest. It wasn't anger, it was something deeper, heavier, a sadness that couldn't be named. Because the worst part wasn't Clarice's lies, it was how quickly people believed them. The same neighbors who used to wave when I mowed the lawn now crossed the street when I walked into town. The guy at the hardware store, the one who used to ask about my dock repair so handed me nails like I might turn them into weapons. The waitress at the diner, who'd poured my coffee for 3 years, now kept her distance like I was one bad day away from snapping. I hadn't changed, but the story around me had. I was no longer Roy Collina, former Anadromines technician, loyal neighbor, friend of the lake. I was a headline, a rumor, a warning. And that kind of story spreads fast. When my father passed away, I started looking at the lake not as a sanctuary anymore but as an ending. There were days I thought about just vanishing, selling everything, letting it all go. Maybe Clarice was right, maybe I really had turned into some bitter old man clinging to a legacy that no longer mattered. Maybe I should have sold my grandfather's cabin for whatever I could get, packed up my old fishing rods and the engineering reports from my Anadromines days, and retired somewhere that didn't know my name or my supposed reputation. I started drinking bourbon most evenings, sitting on my grandfather's porch, staring at the water that once brought me peace, and wondering if the man on the news, the one painted as a threat, was really who I'd become. Someone broken, someone unstable. The lake no longer felt like home. It felt like a mirror, a silent witness to everything I'd done or failed to do. A place where doubt took shape in the ripples and whispered that maybe I'd been wrong all along. Then, one night, Earl showed up. "I figured I'd find you out here feeling sorry for yourself," he said, dropping a full bottle of expensive bourbon on the table like a challenge. "But this lake doesn't need a victim. It needs the man who used to conduct water like it was a symphony." He settled into my grandfather's old rocking chair like he belonged there, uninvited but not unwelcome. With him, he brought the original engineering surveys I'd created during my Anadromines years laid out across the table like a treasure map. Candlelight flickered across old lines and faded notes, and for the first time in a long while, I started to remember what it felt like to be useful. We pored over those maps studying geological features, ancient water flow channels, and pressure zones that had been there long before Clarice Vaughan's first marketing plan. Earl traced them slowly with his weathered finger, listening like the lake itself had started to speak in a language he wanted to learn. And I realized something. I'd been thinking too small. Clarice wanted to play at controlling a lake and managing it with her steel and concrete and tax incentives, but she didn't understand what she was dealing with. This wasn't a zoning battle. This was an ecosystem with a memory, one that didn't take kindly to being paved over. I rolled out my deepest survey mapsa, the kind most people wouldn't know how to read, but I knew like the back of my hand. There, under the spot where her main building now stood, ran deep natural channels, unstable, slow-moving, and long buried by decades of poor planning and human arrogance. I traced a line down one of those fault points and whispered more to myself than to Earl. You ever feel like the land's just been waiting a broken bar for someone to remember how it breathes? This wasn't about sabotage. It wasn't revenge. It was recognition of what happens when you ignore the oldest forces on Earth. If I was wrong, a broken bar, there'd been no undoing what came next. But Earl met my eyes, steady and calm, and I saw no fear, only trust. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when the lake still had a voice and no one else was listening. What we discovered next changed everything. There was a pressure system, one I'd never touched during my time managing surface flows at Andromeda. It ran far deeper. This wasn't about redirecting runoff. This was about returning breath to something that had been suffocating under Clarice's concrete empire. Earl poured another glass of bourbon and raised it like a toast. To your grandfather, he said, and to whatever comes next. I raised my own glass, not in anger, not in vengeance, in purpose. Despite lawsuits, media lies, and a character assassination campaign that would have broken anyone else, Clarice came back swinging. She secured new investors and announced Lake Haven Estates 2.0, an even larger project than before. This time, 80 vacation cabins. Like doubling down on a losing hand just to prove she could, she stood at the podium in a red suit that probably cost more than my truck and called the last storm a freak weather event. Said her new construction techniques were flood-proof, state-of-the-art. She claimed. Her voice carried all the confidence of someone who had never heard no and didn't intend to start now. To her, the flooding was a hiccup, just another engineering problem with a $sign solution. To me, it was proof the land was done being quiet. She called it underutilized land. I looked at her boots sinking half an inch into the mud and thought, you're not building on land a broken bar, you're building on a warning. The lake didn't need my defense. It needed my voice. And for the first time since this mess started, I was ready to give it one. Her next press conference was scheduled for a Friday afternoon, a live broadcast, VIP investors from major cities, full media coverage. She planned to present her vision for Lake Haven's transformation, right there on what she claimed was flood-proof ground. She smiled for the cameras. Her red suit stood bright against the dull gray of concrete and cranes, and behind her, foundation platforms built on lies. Clarice didn't realize yet, but she wasn't about to show them a vision of the future. She was about to give them a demonstration of the past, because the lake remembers. And it was done being polite. She thought her reinforced concrete and polished PR would protect her from anything nature could throw at her. The mayor stood by her side, along with the county commissioner and a few business leaders, all speaking in grand terms about economic revival and job creation, alike they were unveiling a miracle cure instead of an environmental time bomb. I stood hidden behind my grandfather's old oak tree at the edge of the tree line, watching it all unfold with the kind of cold, unshakable resolve that comes only when you know what's about to happen and you are the only one prepared for it. What Clarice and her pricey engineers never bothered to ask, or even imagine, was that I'd spent the previous week quietly undoing their carelessness. They dumped construction debris and filled dirt over ancient underground water channels, disrupting what had worked for thousands of years, all in their rush to build an empire. Using the same geological knowledge I'd spent 15 years honing at Andromeda, I didn't sabotage a thing. I restored it. I cleared natural channels, let the water breathe again, and let the land resume its original shape, something it had been waiting to do since the last ice age. I didn't destroy anything, I just removed the blockages they had no right to put there in the first place. And now, with all that excess weight from Clarice's oversized, overconfident construction sitting on compromised land, the outcome was no longer up to me. It was nature's move. And it made one, right as Clarice smiled into the cameras, boasting about her new and improved forever foundations. I felt it, a shift, deep, silent, like the lake took a breath, and then came the sound, and not a crack or a crash, but a groan, low, reluctant, timeless, as if the earth itself was tired of holding its tongue. Beneath her flagship building, the ground began to settle, slowly, deliberately, differential settling. They call it the kind of structural failure that isn't sudden but certain. The foundations tilted, just a few degrees, but it was enough for every trained eye to see something had gone horribly wrong. Cabins began to sink, not with drama, but with certainty, like ships vanishing beneath a calm sea, one after another, swallowed by the very land Clarice claimed to have conquered. She kept speaking, but the cameras caught Ida, windows bending, frames cracking, concrete moaning under stress. It was quiet at first, then came the shouting. Someone in a pinstriped suit stepped away from her. "You didn't tell us this oil was reactive," he said, eyes locked on the tilting foundation. Then he turned to the press, calm but final. "We're pulling funding immediately." For once, Clarice had no comeback, no deflection, no spin. She just froze. And the media, oh, they loved it. The same reporters who painted me as an unstable saboteur were now spinning a new headline. Clarice Vaughan's Lake Haven, a dream, collapses under its own lies. They dug into the records, found the ignored geological warnings, the discarded environmental impact studies, and the permits approved too fast, under too much pressure. Someone had greased the wheels. And now, the wheels were flying off. The state environmental agency launched a full criminal investigation. Fraud, bribery, environmental negligence. One by one, her investors jumped ship. Her reputation, toxic. Her fortune, gone in legal fees, refund demands, and cleanup costs she couldn't afford. Her empire collapsed like a house of cards. And just like that, she disappeared. No press release, no apology. She was gone. I happened to be out fishing the morning she left, quietly loading boxes into a plain white moving truck. No designer suit, no bodyguards, no smile. She looked a broken bar, smaller, shrunken, like a person standing inside the ruins of a life she never really built with just speed and ego. Once, she stood on the lake's edge and dared it to defy her. Now, the lake had answered. And she didn't scream, she didn't cry, she just a broken bar accepted it, up to her neck in everything she had created and destroyed. And the lake was calm again, like it always is after a storm that had something important to say. She had finally run out of other people's money to spend chasing impossible dreams. I thought about walking over, saying something, maybe offering closure or a final confrontation, but honestly, what was left to say? 6 months later, I stood at the lake's edge, watching the sunset turn the water into a glowing canvas of gold and orange. My hand touched the calm surface like greeting an old friend who had survived a terrible ordeal and come back stronger than before. Lake Haven had returned to its natural state, even more beautiful than before Clarice's reckless interference. New wetlands had formed where her construction once stood, and wildlife was thriving in numbers I hadn't seen for years. The loons were back, calling across the water with voices that seemed to celebrate the silent sea and the peace finally restored to their ancestral home. Earl stopped by most mornings with coffee, and we'd sit on the old dock in comfortable silence, watching mist rise from the water and listening to a place that remembered how to be itself again. The town council had officially designated Lake Haven as a protected natural area, ensuring no commercial development could ever threaten it again. I didn't cheer. I didn't gloat. I just stood there, soaked and shaking, thinking of my grandfather's words, "Respect the water, it's older than all of us and far less forgiving." Clarice forgot that. A lot of people do. They try to bend the land to their will, slap a price tag on what was never theirs to begin with. But nature remembers. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is step aside and let it speak. If you're still here, I'd really like to know what this reminded you of, or what you would have done in my place. And hey, If the story hit something new and you want to support the channel, that little thanks button's always there. Thanks for hanging out. We're in a drama nest, and this is just one of many unbelievable tales. Catch more by checking out the next video. We promise it's even wilder.